Good evening, everyone. I am Lauren Wells. I'm the founder of Creed Strategies, which is a boutique consulting company that I founded 4 years ago to begin to do culturally responsive, equity-based school transformation work. And we also work with nonprofits and government agencies to really help people think about how do we redesign our systems from a place of radical love and equity, and with the purpose of empowering the people where we're located. And I am super thrilled tonight to be here having a conversation with two people who I have known for a very long time, two people who are very, very dear to me, and two people who I think have some of the most brilliant minds that I've ever encountered. One is a mathematician, the other is a poetess. So we have the mathematics of poetry and love and all kinds of things radical that are going to be happening here in this Zoom tonight. So I'm going to introduce them in the order that I met them, and not the order of their importance to me, but just chronologically. So we have Dr. Lamont Terry, who is an associate professor at Occidental College. And his work revolves around culturally responsive education, a lot of it having to do with Black boys and mathematics. He has written several articles with very compelling titles like, "Does the Negro Still Need Separate Schools?" I think we had a class about that and talked about that a lot at some point. Black male social imagery and the disruption of pathological identities, implications for research and teaching. And I think there's also a film that he has been a part of producing that is called Expectations of the System, that looks at a participatory action youth research project that he was a part of at UCLA. And so very excited to have Dr. Terry here with us tonight to drop some mathematics on us.
Thank you for the introduction. It was very sweet. I appreciate it.
Absolutely, my brother. And we have Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, who is many things and who I aspire to be like when I grow into my full academic self. She is an assistant professor at Teachers College, Columbia University, associate professor, sorry, at Teachers College, Columbia University, and my alma mater, one of my alma maters. And she also has a focus on Black and Latino male students, critical English education, culturally relevant pedagogy, racial literacy. She has this beautiful framework that she has created called the Archaeology of the Self that I know we're going to hear more about this evening. And she has published, in addition to a fabulous book, you can see the book cover behind her, a number of journal articles that also have very compelling and provocative titles that really force us, from the time we read the title, to really think about what it is that we're doing in schools and classrooms when we're dealing with young people of color, Black and brown students, in mentoring as well. And so reciprocal love, mentoring Black and Latino male students through an ethos of caring, daring to care, the role of culturally relevant care in mentoring Black and Latino male high school students, education as if Black lives mattered, as if Black lives mattered, and then why Black girl literacies matter, new literacies for a new era. So we are here to talk about all things reimagined, all things transformative, all things revolutionary, if I may speak that word out loud in this very critical moment. And so as we were preparing for this a few minutes ago, this evening I'm excited to be having this conversation on November 9th, 2020, because we sit in a moment that is a moment of relief for me personally and for the people that I know and that I love, where we have gone to the polls and removed 45 from the White House. And that means that there's a new phase being ushered in, both with Joe Biden and, of course, with our sister, Kamala Harris, in the seat of vice president, which is in and of itself monumentous, right? And so we're going to really talk this evening through what does this moment mean and feel like to you all just as human beings, who I also think feel a level of relief and like you can exhale a little bit knowing that we're moving forward in a different pathway. But also, what does this moment mean when you think about the possibilities of education, when you think about your work in education, when we think about it systemically, when we think about what it means for students, but when we also think about what these concepts that you both do so much work around, what do they mean for the practitioners, right? Because a lot of time we're so focused on student outcomes and what it is, what the quote unquote inputs are into students, that we don't really have the conversations that we need to be having about the work that has to be done with the people that work with the students to deliver education that is dignity-based education, humanity-based education, intellectually rigorous education, and education that empowers our young people with a clear understanding of who they are in the world, their place in the world historically, and the place that they can occupy in the future. And so with that being said, I am going to start with my sister, Yolanda, and ask her, how are you feeling in this moment, Dr. Sealey-Ruiz? Tell me.
Let me tell y'all something. First of all, Dr. Lauren, thank you for thinking of me and putting me in this Zoom space with Brother Lamont Terry. The work that he's done, the man that he is, it is an honor to be in fellowship with both of you and with the folks who are online now and those who are coming. So that makes me happy, number one. Number two, Saturday, I took a nap in the middle of the day because I realized how much my body was carrying all of these years. And we had this moment with my mom. I live with my mom and my daughter, who's 16, of these moments of elation, people in my Harlem neighborhood, banging pots, all of that. And then I went to sleep. And it was probably the best nap that I've had in 4 years. Yeah. So while we do what we do best, we know that we have to keep people accountable. Certainly having Queen Kamala, and we'll talk more about that, having her in the Veep seat, having Joe Biden, who is known as a man, no one's perfect, but known as a man that has empathy and compassion for those who have less than, is an exciting moment, but we have to keep them accountable, right? So I took in that moment of joy. I'm still on the high, but now it's time to do the work. That's how I'm doing. I'm feeling reinvigorated and I'm feeling relieved that fascism is going to leave the White House, if I'm going to be straight in political terms, because that's how I saw his reign. I saw it as a reign of terror.
All right. Brother Lamont.
Wow. Yeah, no, I want to just echo my appreciation for being able to join you folks. How am I feeling? Yeah, I would say leading into the Tuesday, I would say that my students, in a lot of ways, at Occidental, were in some senses the canaries in the coal mine. Our student organizers began to challenge the kinds of things that were happening in our classes. They were demanding a little more space, a little more consideration from faculty. They were asking for time off. And that really gave me the sense, I think it just kind of woke me up to what was going on for me as well. So, you know, we had the opportunity to cancel some classes and to do, you know, self-care, which I really appreciated. You know, I guess I feel a measure, a small measure of peace, a little more peace about where we're at. I'm under no illusion that, you know, Joe Biden is the savior. The structure is what it is, right? But I think I have to agree with Yolanda that the idea that this office for everything that it is and is not, has been so degraded that he's really just emboldened some people to kind of step out and step across some lines, as it were. And so I'm thankful that I think that we all have that small measure of peace back in our lives, but still tons of work to do. So.
When you all think about the narrative around the election, the behavior of those who have been supporters of Trump for the last 4 years, when you think about his behavior, the behavior of his leadership, what does that say to you about what needs to be done in education?
Brother Lamont, you want to take a stab at it first?
I'll defer. I'll defer to you.
Listen, one thing about us, we're polite with each other, because this is what happens when you're in a space where you respect people, right? Dr. Lauren, if I could hear your question again, what does it mean in terms of education for what we've seen, right?
Well, and also thinking about the behavior, the narratives, the lack of historical accuracy, all of the things that have made the time that we've existed in for the last 4 years feel like a demented fog, right? Like when I think about the last 4 years, I think about Harry Potter, and I literally think about the Dementors. So, right, so what does that tell you about what we need to do for education to move our populace collectively to a place of higher understanding?
Mm-hmm. No, I mean, it's a brilliant question. So many things are going through my head. First, I just want to say I'm really grateful that we'll have a new Secretary of Education, whoever that person is. Because in Betsy DeVos, we had someone who did not fully understand education. I know that she was a businesswoman, comes from a very successful family. And so education was not really something that was in her spirit, if you will, or even in her wheelhouse of really understanding how do you run. We're not talking about a district here. We're talking about an entire system for a country. So I just want to say that. And with that, it is my hope that the lessons that some parts of America are now learning will be instructive in terms of truths that need to be told in schools. But we have to understand, Trump's lies don't surprise me because America is built on lies, right? America's very foundation was on the lie that some people that look like us were less than human and therefore should have toiled the land and built so that was straight out the gate, America was built on lies. So it doesn't surprise me when it manifests in policies or so boldly is shown in what we saw in 45. I think what we do is, and Dr. Lauren, you said it well, is this idea of history. So I think a lot about Khalil Gibran Muhammad and his work around historical literacy. You see behind me, I have the young adult version of Stamped, but I also have Ibram Kendi's Stamped from the Beginning. And part of the work that I do, part of this archaeology of self-racial literacy development, historical literacy is an important piece. So first we need to do a little bit of overhaul. I'm going to talk about teacher education before we even get into the schools, because who are we turning out of graduate schools of education and putting into schools? So I would love to see an articulation of a new plan, a new deal, if you will, for teacher ed programs, and have that then kind of flesh out into what we're seeing happening in schools. But I think we need to be more rooted in the truth and the hard truth of this country and use it as an opportunity to have a different kind of future, because we are not telling the truth. And that, I think that's why there's so much confusion for us. I don't know if that answers it, but I think I want to connect it to teacher education as much as I do of what's actually happening or not happening in schools.
Okay. Do you want to add or?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's those are brilliant points. How your question strikes me is makes me think about this question of abolition, right? Of now I know that that's a buzzword. It's, you know, as education scholars, it is in some sense a new thing. It's the newest thing. But for those who know, you know, there's a long tradition of thinking about the uselessness of public schools. My students are demanding. Again, I'm a student-centered teacher. I learn a lot from my students, and I think this call for abolition is a real one. I think about not just the need for us to begin to articulate what this might look like beyond the current structures, but I think more resonant with Dr. Yolanda, this notion of, you know, while we are trying to envision something new, what are we doing with what's in existence, right? And you know, most youth will be in public schools, right? As we are imagining what what education can look like outside of schools. And so, you know, I guess I feel a tension, you know, maybe an equal draw towards both the future as well as the present. And I guess maybe that's my more pragmatic side. But what is it that we're doing with youth in schools while at the same time working in real and powerful ways towards developing something new? So again, that I think that just comes out of this idea that I think we all know that Biden and Harris are not going to transform the society that we live in. We can certainly have hopes, and we can certainly have access to resources that we may not have had otherwise. But I'm thinking about, you know, along with, you know, many folks who have gone before me, thinking about imagining the new thing. Right.
So imagine it for us, Dr. Terry. What is that new thing when you get inside that brain of yours and you think about the what should be? What does that look like?
Honestly, I don't know. I don't know what it looks like. I know some things that are valuable that need to come with us as we move, right? So you said I was a mathematician. I'm not a mathematician. I am a math educator. I'm a doer of mathematics, as we all are, and I have a strong identity in that regard. But so I think a lot about, well, what does it look like for my sons who are 9, 7, and 4, doers of mathematics themselves? What does it look like for them to do mathematics in a new and transformed way? And I think it has to revolve around community. It has to revolve around their experience. You know, for example, what does it mean to talk about standards in a new era, in a new system, a new structure? What things do we have to abandon, and what are we abandoning them for? So for me, I think taking this cue from my subfield, right? Whatever this new thing is, it has to be defined by our lived experience. It has to be defined, and it has to resonate with our daily lived experiences, what our needs are in the community, right? Talk about mathematics, not as being defined by chapters and books and standards, but as a cultural activity, right? Like as a culturally responsive activity. So who are we and what are our needs, and how does that define the kinds of math we need to know? I think that principle can be extended across the board. Moreover, I would say that whatever that new education looks like, it has to be interdisciplinary, right? Because we can talk about being good at math, or we could talk about being good at reading, but sucking at math, right? My kids are already saying they hate math. And I'm supposed to be, like, you know, I'm a math educator, so I'm supposed to be good at this, right? I'm supposed to be safeguarding their experiences and their identities. But there's something about the system that is problematic, right? And so to begin for us to think about how math speaks and exists with other areas, right? Most obviously science. Those two disciplines are couched couched, next to each other, but to begin to think about the relationship between mathematics and other fields is also key, so that when we're learning in broad context, specific skills in broad context, not just learning math, learning science, learning reading, so forth. Maybe most importantly, and I don't want to dominate the combo here, but maybe most importantly, taking up this issue of anti-Blackness. So that new system has to be a system where we are free to be. And I know there's a lot of conversation about what humanity means, right? So what is the category of humanity? What does it mean in light of anti-Blackness? Is that a limit that we need to break through and begin to articulate different identities and sets of relationships and whatnot? But my kids need to feel free to be who they are and not be restricted in any response. And that new education has to offer them that, at least. So there's a few of my thoughts.
All right, Dr. Yolanda, that head is nodding over there.
No, I mean, Dr. Lamont, that was so beautiful. And at one point when you were speaking, I just actually felt like visceral reactions in my body. And I'll start a little bit just with where you ended. And when you talk about anti-Blackness, one of the things that I just jotted down is that to be in schools where the policies don't violate our children, don't violate their bodies, don't violate their minds, don't violate their sense of identity, that actually has a respect for what the communities that they're nurtured in, what that contributes to school communities and otherwise. I was thinking a couple of things. I was thinking of issues of teacher recruitment, of our children having teachers who look like them, and not to over romanticize, when we were in segregated schools, but there was something powerful. If you look at the work of Michelle Foster, Black Teachers on Teaching, there was something very powerful about that dynamic, because the Black teachers were fully invested in the children that they were teaching. And that is, and I'm not saying there are no teachers who invested, we know that there are, but I'm talking about systemically, the ethos was, that is my child, not it could be my child, that is my child. And so everything that I do is going to be wrapped around the idea that they will be successful. So I'd like to see some policies, some difference in teacher recruitment, and also supporting teachers when they're there, particularly teachers of color. I think a lot these days about curriculum, because I'm in conversation with my bestie, Dr. Goldeen Muhammad, and her book, Cultivating Genius, really is offering a beautiful Black print, not blueprint, Black print for what our children need by way of curriculum. Joy needs to be there, criticality, intellectualism, right? This kind of understanding of history, all of that. I'd like to see a curriculum writ large that addresses that. And guess what? When Black children are paid attention to and brown children are paid attention to, everyone's paid attention to. Because if you pay attention to the least of these, those who have more anyway will continue to flourish. So I would like to see a system that is really has a concerted effort on human flourishing, and curriculums and teachers and ethos within schools that allow that to happen. So I don't know if it's called Wakanda. I don't know what it's called, but it's something where humans, like Dr. Lamont talked about his boys, that they can be free. Yeah. How can we be free?
So can you talk a little bit, Dr. Yolanda Sealey-Ruiz, about how the archaeology of the self fits into all of what you just described from Dr. Terry, right, all the way down, this sort of vision that you just created, that we have an educational paradigm that comes from, that is community-centric, culture-centric, need-centric, based on lived experience, right? Where learning is a cultural activity, right? It's not a rote technical thing that you do, but it's done, something that's done in interaction with the world and with other people, that it's grounded in who we are, what our needs are, and based on that, what do we need to know in order to exist in the world that we live in, the interdisciplinary components of it, this anti-Blackness, right? And eliminating that from the meta cognitive thought that we have as a nation, right? It's sort of like this meta ethos. It's, you know, it's in the ether, it's in the air, it's in the water. You know, if you're not infected with it, it's because something has disrupted the infection throughout the course of your life. And if you're a Black person, you have a strong positive identity if you've had some serum. And if not, you walk around with a lot of internalized self-hatred and racism, right? So we are all have that put on us. And so when we think about this notion of the archaeology of the self and this pyramid that you've built, starting first with the educators and the work that we have to do in order to create this kind of environment, how does that fit in? What does it look like? How does it take hold in a place? And then how does it grow once it's got its roots going?
So first I want to thank you for your brilliance, Dr. Lauren, because you know how to ask some questions and you'll be throwing down some gems while you asking questions. So can we pause for a minute and just kind of like, oh, okay, can I acknowledge that?
Thank you, dear.
Having said that, yes, the archaeology of the self is a basic human principle about knowing who you are. And as it relates to children, it's important to know where anything that's going to prevent you from being fully human with them and anything that is going to prevent me, the teacher, from seeing their full humanity must be excavated. And so as part of this racial literacy development paradigm that I am working on, that's the pyramid that you mentioned, a part of that, a significant part of that, in addition to critical love, and critical is in front of everything because, you know, what we're trying to do in our work and scholars like us is to combat the erasure. Like people want to say that education is neutral, you know, no, it's not neutral. So that's why you have critical race scholars that use that word critical, because it pays attention to all of our social identity markers that have created the situations that we're experiencing now. And so when I talk about critical love as part of that paradigm, it's having this very deep and profound ethical commitment to these communities you serve and loving them towards their liberation and loving you, teacher, yourself towards your own liberation. Because guess what? Like Spike Lee said, you've been bamboozled too. We're all under that same smog that Beverly Daniel Tatum talked about that you alluded to. Everybody's breathing in the same racist air. So everything that we do should be rooted in love, and love for the freedom, as Dr. Lamont was saying, of the child, but also ourselves. There has to be a critical reflection. You're reflecting deeply about how these social identity markers impact who you are and what you do. There has to be a critical humility. And for those brothers and sisters who identify as white, you have to be humble enough to understand that you do have power, even when you don't want it, right? And that kind of interpretation, misuse, misalignment, misgivings of power have put you in a space of arrogance, whether you want to admit it. So you have to be humble enough to know that you have to accept that the way things have been structured have put you above someone ideologically just by the fact that we're living in a racist society. So coming to this with a humble heart, what do I need to know? What do I need to understand? That humility goes a long way. And then there's critical literacy, historical literacy. You got to understand the history of the country. You got to understand the history of the school district and the history of that school, and really understand the power of the communities and how they have shaped it and what has been erased. And then there's arc of self, and above that there's interruption. But the arc of self piece is simply doing this, doing a deep excavation of where do these biases, stereotypes, Where do they live within? And what I suggest is that we do that work to excavate and replace it with critical love. But we have to do that self-work. If you go to therapy, the first thing the therapist is telling you is trying to trace back, where is this connected to? So if you have racist ideology, you can't just say it is the way it is, it's the smog. Where in your family do you trace that? Are you tracing it to how you're perpetuating those ideas instead of interrupting them? So it's a hard, honest look at the self, at the heart. That's the arc of self. And I'll just say this, it has to be the self, because we could all go through all of these PDs and it will just remain intellectualized. We can get the information, learn CRE, learn all of these terms, but if the heart is not open to change, and if we do not practice that change, it will not be sustained. So the self is actually the way that we create and sustain change while we're learning the terms and all these other things. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so my team, we were doing a professional development last week actually for a school district, entire district, 600 people. And there's a portion of it where we begin, the meat of it was around culturally responsive, sustaining education and getting people to kind of reflect on their practices around it, but we grounded it in equity is the reason, right? Like equity is what the goal of all of this is. And then we pull them through some strands around beliefs. And this one very unexpected gentleman, when we were asking them to kind of think about their implicit biases and blind spots that they might have that impact their practice, got on the Zoom and said, you know, I come from a family and my father had some very hardcore deterministic genetic beliefs about people based on race, about people based on ability. I have a son who is autistic. And so now I, very in my lived experience, wrestle as a parent and also as a teacher with the fact that these beliefs shaped my whole upbringing. And so it was just really in a moment, you know, to come out in front of your entire school district and to name that is exactly what you're talking about. And it's not something that happens often in my experience, that people are so bold in really laying it on the plate and, you know, being willing to look at it and to dissect it in a way that is just so straightforward and so transparent, but also so humble, like you just mentioned in terms of the critical humility. So it's, you know, it's nice to just to see that there's a real clear frame that you have created that can be used to help people kind of situate their own developmental process in. And I'm curious to hear from you, Dr. Lamont, because I've known you for a very long time. And my memories of you when we were, you know, in class together is that my memories of you when we were in class together is, right, there was some of us who were just like, raw, like, what's it, like, we're gonna burn this institution down as soon as we possibly can. And, you know, as your demeanor shows you right now, shows, you know, you are a little more kind of low key, you have a different approach to it. You know, you have also been grounded in sort of this ideology of love. And I'm curious in your work, how it is with your students on campus in the teacher education program, what it looks like for you to bring your students to a place of awakening, right? Because it's almost like an awakening. There's a in Buddhism, it's like peeling away obscurations, right? So you can get to a place where you can kind of see clearly who you were before you got all the crap that we have. What does that look like for you with your teacher education students?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think your observation about me in grad school is probably accurate. A lot of that I think has to do with my journey through the academy, right? So I came to a predominantly white institution, a historically white institution, private liberal arts. I actually went to the school I teach at. And I was a math major. I was one of 2 Black students majoring in math. And I feel like my time as an undergraduate in my discipline was very much keep your head down, master your content, get out, right? And so the thing that brought me to UCLA was having had now at that time some 6 years under my belt in a math classroom. I realized that there were problems that went beyond the content, right? Like this assumption that math is a universal language, right? Not culturally accessed, was something that I was pretty deeply committed to. And UCLA, the program and the faculty and the colleagues, really opened my eyes to how all of these things are socially constructed. So what you probably interpreted as mellow was me, doing some measured learning and really, doing maybe some of that self-work that my colleague is talking about, right? So really trying to open up and to identify why I was thinking the way about mathematics and students, the way that I was. And so I appreciate love. I want to piggyback on something my colleague said about this critical love. And I really want to, I like that. I think what I'm hearing you say is love is not defined by emotion, but it's defined by an ethic, a set of principles. And I think that's really important, something to offer. And I don't draw a huge distinction between undergraduate students, future teachers and in-service teachers. I work with both of them, and there's not a whole lot of difference, right? It's about unpacking their experiences, and undergrads have fewer experiences than, let's say, in-service teachers. But I'd like to be able to offer them, and I think it's important to offer them a starting point, and that is this kind of internal, critical interrogation of self, with the goal being love, and you hear love and you can see outside of family, outside of kinfolk, it seems something that's I mean, it's everyone has their view about what that is, right? And so I love the fact that Dr. Yolanda, what you're doing is you're fixing this notion of ethic there, and using that as a sort of a way to anchor what it means to love people, because even those folks like you described, Lauren, who have this history of white supremacy, right? Or whatever it may be. Everyone from them to people who are on board and who are ready to do the work, right? What they each need to know is that working with the kids, the youth that we care about that look like us, isn't about their emotions. I mean, certainly we can't detach emotions from who we are as human beings. But when we're encouraging them towards love, we're not encouraging them towards affection for those people. We're we're at first saying that it's about the ethics. It's about the set of guiding principles and personal ethics that you have that then get translated into professional practice. And for me, that's a really important thing, because it offers people who don't necessarily like you, right? They might be sitting in a PD or sitting in my classroom smiling, but don't like me, right? It gives them a sort of an objective place to start. And that is, how do I sort of bang out and make sense of these professional principles that I'm being called into, despite that past, whether I'm being open and honest about it or not. Maybe I don't even know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. No, I don't mean to interrupt. I'm just saying, wow. And I'm so glad this is recorded, because, brother, I'm still working on this. And so I will be citing you when I write about critical love. If it's okay, I would like to cite this conversation, because you just opened up my mind in such a beautiful way. Wow.
Oh, that's dope. I appreciate that. So I'm a Frarian, and I'm a Frarian. I hear elements of those values in what I'm hearing. my students right now, my Black students in particular, shout out Anjali, shout out to my colleague Kinjis, Dr. Watson, are forcing me to rethink what it means to be a Frarian. And I had started off earlier in your question about what it means for education, thinking down this road, but like how to make sense of what it means to love, what it means to be a human. Those are questions that Freire takes up. And as you know, and I have this class that I'm teaching, and I started the class because I wanted to think more deeply about this question, right? As a black person, as a scholar, a Black scholar, as a critical scholar, what does it mean to try to reconcile Freire with my experience as a Black person and what we know? And there are, I think there are serious tensions between this notion of humanity that we're driving towards, at least that Freire was driving towards, and the kinds of criticisms that, you know, someone like Frantz Fanon would put on the table, which I think are echoed in the voices of my students today, right? And so, like, I'm thinking carefully now about the answer of what it, you know, can Black people ever be human in the United States? And of course we're human, right? Of course, biologically, there aren't these distinctions, right? But human is a socially constructed category as well, right? That sits alongside the biological realities like race. There are biological realities that people point to, and they construct this idea of race. And I think I've been, for a long time as a scholar, you know, people, my colleagues, my Black colleagues in particular, have been giving me side eye when I identify as a Frarian. And I've been trying to work this out for myself. Like, what is this deep tension? I'm someone that feels strongly about love, not in a necessarily an emotional sense, but in terms of humanity, right? Like, we can all be human, and we all are human. So let's get on board. And there's something nagging in the minds of Black folks about you know, these ideas. Do they mesh together well? And so a lot of these questions are still unanswered for me, right? Because I think there's what it means to be Black in the United States is in tension with these categories that we uplift and uphold: humanity, love, freedom, all of these things. And so the answer is somewhere in between, I hope. But some people don't think that's the case. So
you're right, Dr. Yoli. We don't have enough time. I'm so sad because I want to talk to y'all now. I don't want to ask some more questions because I have some things I want to say.
But can I say something to Dr. Lamont? Can I invite you to think about, if you have not already, brother, to write an article, something like Freire, Fanon, and me? Because as I've listened to you, that is a piece that I would, number one, love to read selfishly, but number two, love to read and put in conversation with my ideas as they're developing around love, because everything I do is rooted in that love. This is why I left corporate America for 13 years and knew I had to teach, and started teaching at night, and then realized I had to leave that world because it was the students, the teaching, that set my soul on fire. But this piece of Freire, Fanon, and me, whew, I think you could set that on fire.
I'm on it. I'm on sabbatical in the spring, and that's my number one. That's my number one job. So we need to talk. We need to talk. I love to hear your ideas, for sure.
And you brought it like full circle to where you opened with the history of the US, right? And the reality that it's built on these lies, like the lie that we are not human, the lie that we are less than, like a whole series. We could do a timeline of lies. But then I kind of, think about the pyramid, and although it's not an exact one-to-one, it makes me think of Maslow, right? Which is a human need pyramid. And then this whole conversation of love, because part of what I think about in my personal life, but also what I think about in my work is the way that places feel to human beings, and what that does to us neurochemically, neurobiologically, neurophysiologically, right? Like students who don't feel like they belong are not in an emotional state to learn, literally, because your body is producing a whole set of chemical reactions that are the opposite, that are necessary for your mind to be able to be open to a learning process. You're in fight or flight, you're in stress and survival mode. And so when we have this conversation about love, and it's interesting, the two of you, right, sitting here, the vortex, love from the vortex, and thinking about the Freudian notion of love, there are pieces of it that bring me back to, I mean, they get a little bit metaphysical, right? The reality that when we talk about emotions in our bodies, we're talking about thoughts and feelings, which are frequencies, right? And you can electrically measure what is happening in a human being based on what their thoughts and their feelings are. And so that there is this whole sort of energetic reality that we're also talking about, that is, what are the interpersonal connections that happen between people when you're operating either from a place of love and truth and humanity, or you're operating from a place of lies, dishonesty, oppression, and hate. And so I think that there's a kind of a real, I don't think that it's odd to want to have to focus love at the center of what we do. I think that that's actually probably the most fundamental expression of our humanity that we can get back to. And because it's been so stolen from us, and it really is a struggle to, you know, to operate from a place of not, I'm going to forgive everything, that I'm going to overlook history, I'm going to ignore history, I'm not going to remember history as I think about the future, kind of love, right? Which is not a critical, which is not a liberating, which is not a self-determined love, but a place of full awareness that like my humanity, like my health, my well-being, my life actually requires that I'm functioning from a place of love in all things, and not from the toxic obscurations that have been dumped into us since we began sort of moving around this planet. So I just kind of, you know, add that as another layer to thinking about why, you know, there are certain ways of seeing things that become more attractive to us over time, or more compelling to us over time, because it actually centers something very core in our essence and our being. And I think it takes people different pathways to get to a place where you can really fully kind of center the work in an ethic of love, an ethic of care, an ethic of humanity and dignity. And so I too want to read that paper, and, you know, think about then what that kind of means for me in the way that I think about systems and how systems are organized, and that systems actually have to be organized to be places where people are joyful to be, right? Because joy is love. And if a classroom isn't joyful, no one wants to be there, not the teachers or the students. If a school isn't joyful, right? Like we know what those buildings feel like when you walk into them, and it just hits you with this energy of dampness, of darkness, of like, of lack of care, of lack of energy, like there's no evidence of intellect or curiosity or those sorts of things. And so I think there's some interesting other parallels that have come out from your deep discussion with love. And there's so many questions in here. Well, there's a couple of questions in here that I want to back up. If we could just transition into some time for Q&A with folks. And we could have easily done an hour and a half, but you know, you guys are very busy, important people, and I didn't want to commandeer your time. Ronnie Reagan asks, do you think it makes a difference that the First Lady is an educator? Do you think that that will impact what the educational policies of the next administration look like, and why?
Ronnie, first of all, beautiful, wonderful question. And my first answer is yes. And for no other reason, just her orientation to education, her relationship to education. You know, when you do something for so many years, even when you leave or you retire, it's still so much a part of who you are and how you see the world. And so I do believe, and particularly because as a second lady, she was still teaching at the community college. And so it's clearly part of her identity. And I think, you know, all floatists have some kind of focus. I do think that that's going to, I hope that that's going to be a focus. And if nothing else, will elevate the conversation around education and resources and needs in a way that perhaps we've not yet really seen in this country, that has not been masked under a policy, like, you know, No Child Left Behind. I'm looking forward to a more nuanced conversation just because of her relationship with education.
I don't have anything to add to that. Perfect. Yeah.
If anyone has any questions, please
Brother
go
Lamont, you awesome.
go ahead and drop them in the chat box. We're gonna keep vibing over here, but I'll keep checking back to the chat box. And so we've been fairly theoretical.